Gab, thank you. I'm over the moon happy to be here. CAM is amazing, and when they asked me to do this show almost a year ago now, I was so excited. They're so forward-thinking in terms of art institutions. They're absolutely at the forefront, and I'm so grateful. Thank you so much. So this is No Damsel. I've been working on this, like Gab said, since May 14th. I've been here 12 hours every single day. It's like I'm living here, and I'm so happy that it's finally done and everything's hung and that you can see it. I started this project as wall paintings in Los Angeles, and it was in the Arts District. It was downtown LA, and I began it as a sort of a fun project, just taking the Disney princesses and changing them a little bit. I wanted to make them a little bit more modern and accessible. And as I did that, I got a overwhelmingly positive response. People loved them. And so I started to do it more and more. I did them for some businesses, some high-end boutiques, some private homes of mostly women who wanted them in their gardens and things like that. And as I did it more and more, I started to do a little more research and development and learn more about the princesses, more about how they came into existence, more about Walt Disney Studios. And the first thing that struck me in my research is that in its inception in 1937, up until the 60s or 70s, Walt Disney Studios was completely divided by gender. So women were not hired for any creative position. If you were applying to be a storyboard artist or a writer or an animator, you were denied and you were forwarded to the ink and paint department. So women were hired in the ink and paint department. It was a process. Every movie is made of about 500,000 animation cells, short for celluloid. They're clear sheets that you hand paint every single one using very special paint. And the women were in charge of what is essentially a paint-by-numbers process of outlining and hand painting them. So they worked in a separate area of the studio. It was completely segregated, and it went on like that for a very, very long time. The hours they worked were extremely long. It was really not a great work environment. So that is something that just floored me. I couldn't believe it. And I started to watch these movies again. I hadn't watched them since I was a little girl, and of course I loved them, as any girl my age did. And it just struck me how truly problematic they were in terms of their representations of women. I had never thought about it before, and rewatched the entirety of the princess films, and I just couldn't believe it. Every one of them, except really one, either ended in a marriage or it was implied that they were about to get married. They just sort of cooked and cleaned and sang. They were all these beautiful, very thin young women. And I couldn't believe that this was something that we were putting on for our children, starting at about 2 years old, just on repeat. And so I wanted to do something that was playing with this, that was altering this. So I started to create more of these princesses. I gave them each their own personality, and I wanted to show something that was a less narrow view of what femininity and womanhood was. These movies show a very definitive look of what it means to be a woman, and I wanted to kind of open that up a little bit. We're using these movies that are extremely influential, and it's almost the first thing that a young woman sees of what it means to be a fully formed woman, where your whole existence is seeking validation from men. So I started to create these, and my first step was figuring out, how did they make these cells? What was the process? So if you'll see over here, I have these animation cells. I looked up everything I could about it. Of course, it's a dying art, so it was very difficult for me to find anything related to this. I found the only place in America that still makes these very special paints. They're made out of vinyl. It's called the Cartoon Color Company, and Been around since the 40s. It's the place that supplied every single animator and animated movie, short, TV show that you can think of. It's very expensive to have the products ship. It's all temperature controlled. And because I live in Los Angeles, I thought, I bet it's in Los Angeles. And it was. It was about 5 minutes from my house. And so I went. They couldn't believe that I was there. They were very confused. Why would I be doing this? There's computers now. There's no point for me to be making these. And I started to incorporate them into my work. To my knowledge, there isn't another artist who's working with these materials. I've never seen it. I'd be really interested if there is. And it's so difficult. I can't stress this to you enough. The way that these cells came into existence, they stopped using them in the mid-90s. But before that, it was a mentorship thing. So people taught each other. These women were instructing each other in a type of lineage, but I didn't really have anyone to do that. So I had this idea to start contacting women who had worked at Walt Disney Studios, and starting in the 70s, they would hire, one female animator, then they wouldn't hire one again. And in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, they would hire, one animator, one female storyboard artist, one writer. And so I started contacting them just to say, what has been your experience as an animator, as a writer? How did you get hired? What was your life like at this time? These were all young women who were coming into a field that was extremely male-dominated, and I just wanted to know what they thought. So it took a lot of work. It was a lot of Googling, and I finally started tracking them down and interviewing them. I interviewed storyboard artists, writers, animators who worked on almost every movie that you see here, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, director of Brave, who worked on all of these movies and worked so hard that she ascended to being a director. She's the first ever woman to direct a feature-length, major motion picture animated film. And they were amazing. And what really was unbelievable to me, that you'd think that coming into the 90s and early 2000s that we would have really progressed in terms of our representations of women, but that didn't seem to be the case at all. I talked to one woman that worked on Beauty and the Beast. She was a writer, and if you'll see here, I have Belle with the globe. She wrote a scene that Belle is seen putting pins into a map of places that she wants to travel to. She presented it to her all-male writing staff, and they cut it. They said that that was unrealistic for women. Women don't travel. They have no urge to travel. Would never be seen doing that. So in the final cut of the movie, she is icing a cake, which is so much more realistic for women. So with this, I wanted to give Belle back her travel scene. And you'll see here, most of these they're very accessible when you first immediately come see them. But as you look at them, the details emerge. And I really wanted to create something that you could spend 5 minutes or 5 hours in here looking at. So I talked to these women, and I really wanted to speak with someone who worked in the 1950s or 60s when it was still gender segregated. And of course, by sheer numbers, they'd be in their mid-90s by now. So I spent a lot of time searching each of these names. Hundreds of women worked in the ink and paint department, and of course, a lot of obituaries sadly came up. And I finally found one woman. Her name's Joanna Ramirsa, and I wrote to her. She contacted me. She's in her mid-90s, and she was 18 years old, and she inked on Sleeping Beauty, and I just couldn't believe it. So I talked to her, and it was like hitting the jackpot. We've spoken for hours, and she told me all her stories of working as a teenager at Walt Disney Studios, telling me about her bosses, about how she was the best in her group. She went to her boss, said, I want to be an animator, and he said, no, you're going to get married and have babies. Why would we train you at this? Women don't have the creative capacity to be animators. No, you're in the ink and paint department forever. This is your role. That's it. So she actually quit. She got a job at another studio. She became an animator, then a producer, and she's just the most inspiring woman. So it was wonderful to talk to her. And what I loved about her is one of her her key kind of goals in life was to inspire other women. She talked a lot about this mentorship process and how it was so important to her to bring other women up in animation. And what I wanted to do with this project from its inception was create something that was accessible to young people, specifically young women. There's not a lot of art that's being created for young people. Art is very narrow, and as you ascend to the very top in the auctions and galleries and museums, there's a very limited group of people that decide what art is and what good art is, and that's typically gendered and it's typically racialized. So I wanted to create a work that was accessible to a wider audience. I wanted a young woman who, of course, young people are smart. I don't think that they get enough credit. I wanted something that was challenging, but in a way that was easily read. So what I like about this is that we've had a ton of young people coming in. CAM has an amazing young docent program, and I've been able to talk to so many people, and I'm so excited about the reaction. It's been absolutely wonderful, and yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited that this is finally finished, and I would love to know if anyone has any questions. There's so much to this project that it's really, really difficult to cover everything and to convey, every single aspect of it. There's a lot of things going on. And so please let me know if there's anything else that you would like to know.
Burning questions?
Yes.
Which one inspired you the most personally growing up, and then looking back on it, now you see that inspiration was problematic?
Oh, absolutely. I would say my go-to was Beauty and the Beast. I loved Belle. I really identified with her. The movie begins with her saying that she wants more from her small town, which I find interesting that they then cut the scene where she expresses that she wants to travel. Looking back on it, I really couldn't believe that the entire film ends with her falling in love with her captor and then marrying him. And I think that the end goal being marriage in these movies was really, really problematic, and I think that being the unifying theme among all of these films is something I really, really wanted to push back against. So I would say that she is probably who I identified with most at the time, and reflecting back, there's huge problems with all of the movies, so I really tried to show Belle here as more of an individual and kind of reclaiming her interests that are much bigger than simply getting married at the end of her film. And I really wanted to do that with all of these princesses. The title of the show is No Damsel, and I wanted to show that you don't have to be a damsel in distress. Yes?
So what was your process by taking a princess and take an older princess, because Belle's not an older princess.
Right.
So how did you look at that princess at that time and decide how you were going to do her?
Right, absolutely. So I talked to a lot of people to make the show happen. And one of my key questions was, how would you like to see yourself better reflected in this narrative? So I talked to just scores of people, mainly women, and asked these kind of questions. And I took those answers and details and factored them into when I was creating these new reimaginings of these princesses. So for the older princesses specifically, their characters and their poor reflections of women are, of course, a reflection of the times, and they're a reflection of the fact that they were written by an entirely male staff. So if you have 50 men coming together to create one female character, of course the idea of her is going to be skewed and one-dimensional. Snow White spends her whole time in the movie cleaning and cooking and either being happy or scared. And I think that's a huge reflection of the fact that there was no female voice weighing in and saying maybe that there's something else she can do or be interested in. So I wanted to take an element of the movie, flip it around, and keep it with the character that I created. And I also think that these older movies are also a reflection of the time. So for example, with Sleeping Beauty, this came out in 1959. This was at a time when feminism was gaining a lot of traction. It was the second wave of feminism. Women were really getting fired up They were burning their bras. It was a thing in America. And that wasn't reflected in this movie. I would say that Sleeping Beauty is the most regressive Disney film. She has 18 lines of dialogue in her whole movie, and she's the protagonist. That's just unbelievable for me for a movie. And so I wanted to make her the quintessential feminist. She's the women's rights activist. So I took that negative representation and used it for what I created. And I tried really hard to do that with all of the films. But the older ones they were just sort of different, because I do think that Disney is progressing. I don't know if that has commercial incentives, because of course we are progressing as a society. But yeah, the older ones were interesting to remake, definitely. Yeah.
Which is the one that doesn't follow the mold? You said there was one.
Oh yeah, so Pocahontas was the first princess to not get married at the end of her film. Between Snow White, 1937, and Pocahontas, there was 58 years before a Disney princess didn't get married. So that's generations of young women seeing these movies and thinking to themselves, okay, I want to be a princess. What princesses want is to get married, so that must be what I want. So with the actual Pocahontas story, that's not how her story ends, and the Disneyfication of Pocahontas is terrible. And if you would like to know more about that, please come ask me and I will be happy to talk to you about it, because I could just talk forever about all of this. So interestingly, that's not how her story actually ends, but her story for Disney ends with her waving goodbye to her love interest, doesn't get married, which I really like, to be honest. And there's aspects to all of these movies that I can't appreciate. A lot of them have beautiful, rich animation. I'm not saying that I don't like it, but that was the first princess that didn't get married. That kind of broke the mold. Yeah.
Dorian, will you talk a little bit about the expressions on Snow White and Jasmine?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to portray a range of emotion and expression, and the default expression for princesses is happy, accommodating, is smiling. And as I myself am not an animator, it was really difficult for me to figure out what an aggressive or angry princess looked like, or a princess with attitude. So it was absolutely a learning curve to figure out what that would be. And I talked to a lot of these women who were animators just to say, hey, how do I do this? So in these wall paintings, if you'll take a look around, I have some concept sketches of as I was developing it, but the attitude that I've imbibed these princesses with was not easy to come to, and I think it's something that I'm still working on. But that level of focus, determination, isn't something that is a princess trait. Anything strength, anything violence, isn't something that's represented in women in these movies. And of course, women have these traits. So I really wanted to represent something that was a little bit more visceral and a little bit more angry, for lack of a better word.